My name is Bobbi Brooks. Join me and my team as we take a look into the history of haunted locations. Not only will we break down the history, we will also hunt for the spirits that reside in these locations. You are watching Haunted History of the Paranormal. Alton, Illinois, home of legends and a vast supply of history. From a dragon-like bird that terrorized the Illini Indian tribe to a gentle giant that touched the hearts of so many. In this episode, we are going to focus on the Civil War, the smallpox epidemic, and the spirits that linger still to this day from such a tragic time in Alton's history. Welcome to my hometown, Alton, Illinois. Today we are going to chat with local author John Dunphy about the history of the Civil War and how it played a role in making Alton one of the most haunted small towns in the world. After our chat, we are going to follow in the footsteps of some of the lost souls from the Civil War, from the prison to the grave. We are in Second Reading Bookstore, owned and operated by author John Dunphy, who's going to talk with us a little bit about the Civil War and the role that Alton played in it. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Bobby. Glad to be here. Of course, I'm John Dunphy. This is Bewitched, the cat. So.
Love the cats. Love the cats. Well, thank you very much for letting us come in. You've always been a great friend to me, but you're also very knowledgeable in the history of the Civil War.
I am indeed. I like to think that I am. I am the author of this book, Abolitionism in the Civil War in Southwestern Illinois, published by the History Press in 2011. It's currently in 82 libraries, according to WorldCat, including 5 Ivy League schools, Harvard, Cornell, Penn, Brown, and Princeton.
And it's a great book. Absolutely love it.
But getting back to the Civil War, Illinois was a free state, of course, associated with the Union, but it was an important station on the Underground Railroad, so slavery did play a role in the history of this area. Alton contained a number of Underground Railroad stations. In fact, we are sitting in one right now. This very building, located at 16 East Broadway in Alton, was built in 1831. In 1840, as you'll read in my book, it was purchased by an expatriate Massachusetts family, and they converted it into a stop on the Underground Railroad. Fugitive slaves from Missouri, the slave state just across the river, tasted freedom for the first time when they reached this building.
I did not know that this building was part of the Underground Railroad.
I'm very proud of that legacy.
That's really neat, especially with your history background, to have a location that was actually part of it. It just kind of meshes you more with it.
It does. The house you see on the cover here, my great aunt grew up in this house, the Hurlbut Messenger House. It once stood in Upper Alton, where Calvary Baptist Church now stands. It was torn down in 1957 when I was much too young to do anything about it. But my wife and I purchased this building, so it'll be ours forever, and possibly a bit longer if people like you have anything to do about it. We'll haunt it when we're dead, but it will never be torn down. It will be preserved. This station in the Underground Railroad, a citadel of liberty.
Right, and there's numerous places on Broadway.
There are indeed. The Enos apartment building up on 3rd Street. There were several stops in Alton along East Broadway. The buildings themselves no longer exist, but there are still some stations standing here in the Alton area, and you'll read about that in the chapter on the Underground Railroad in my book.
That's just, I really like that history. So now, what role did Alton have with the Civil War?
Well, Alton played 2 primary roles in the Civil War. We hosted a Confederate prison, a prison to hold Confederate POWs during the Civil War. It was the original Illinois State Penitentiary, built in 1833. It was closed just before the outbreak of the Civil War, but there were so many Confederate POWs in the St. Louis prisons that they needed the extra space over here, so the prison was reopened. It housed Confederate POWs, it housed Union troops who'd been court-martialed for one offense or another, Confederate sympathizers, and the 4th category I thought was so interesting, bushwhackers. Bushwhackers were, in a sense, were Confederate guerrillas, not associated with military units, but they committed acts of murder or sabotage to aid the Confederate cause.
And that was, we're going to be visiting the actual area of the prison. They have kind of like a monument of it. It's not the actual prison itself, but we're going to go down there in a little bit and run some EVPs and do some quick history while we're down there when we take our trip from the prison to the grave. Now, that's another thing I want to talk about, the prison to the grave, because there was some major things that happened with this prison? For one, it wasn't built to hold as many people.
No, it wasn't built. Overcrowding, lack of sanitary facilities, and remember, this is the 1860s. Modern medical science was in its infancy. The germ theory of disease hadn't been accepted yet. In 1862, a prisoner infected with smallpox arrived at the penitentiary, and the disease just spread throughout the prison population. Men were dying left and right. Originally, victims of the smallpox epidemic were buried at the Confederate Cemetery on Rosier Street in North Alton. But then, as the contagion became even worse, the townspeople wanted these infected prisoners out of the city, so they established an isolation hospital on an island we call Smallpox Island in the Mississippi, just adjacent to the prison. Now, the isolation hospital, if you were taken there and died, you were buried on the island. You were not taken to Confederate Cemetery. The islands had a curious fate, a curious history. Many of the bodies buried there, we believe, were washed away by floods in the late 19th century. But the greatest catastrophe occurred in the 1930s when the original Lock and Dam 26, was built in Alton. It was the height of the Depression. The priority was building the lock and dam, not preserving history, not preserving remains. As you read in the book, during the excavations for the lock and dam, skeletons were unearthed, bones were everywhere. People even made their way to the island and came away with grisly souvenirs like skulls and various bones to adorn their man caves, I guess. Now when you visit, well, it really isn't an island anymore. It's called the Lincoln Shields Recreation Area. It's more of a peninsula. It juts out from the Missouri side of the Mississippi. But there is a monument there which lists the names of the 262 men and one woman. One woman was buried on the island. And another curious point, visitors to the Lincoln Shields Recreation Area will note that part of the original lock and dam is still intact there. It wasn't blown up with the rest. That's right across the river. People believe that that remnant of the lock and dam was left there as an observation point. And it is a great observation point. You can ascend the stairs and have a great view of the river. But the real reason it wasn't blown up was because they determined there are still skeletons of the Confederate dead beneath that structure. If they had blown up that structure, skeletons would have been flying through the air. So when you go over there, remember there are still Confederate dead on the remnants.
Just added another trip to our
it's very worthwhile. It's a very poignant, very restful place. But the names of 262 men and the one woman, she was a resident of Memphis, Tennessee, a civilian, naturally, not in the Army, but she was convicted of selling revolvers to the Confederate Army, and that was a treasonable offense, so she was brought to the prison, contracted smallpox, sent to Smallpox Island, and perished there.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy. Well, that's adding to another place for us to go to this afternoon, which is exciting.
And to add something from my friend Bobbi here, of course you'll want to explore the old Confederate prison. The old Confederate cemetery, but many people talk about Hop Hollow. They'll say, well, that was the pathway from the shore taking prisoners to be buried at the Confederate cemetery. Evidently, there was a ferry on the Mississippi, and Confederate who died in the prison were taken by the ferry to this particular point on the shore, then taken on a road leading through Hop Hollow to the Confederate cemetery, and that's all true. What many people don't know is there's another cemetery, not Confederate cemetery, another cemetery in that area. From 1848 to 1858, there was an old Catholic cemetery there adjacent to the Confederate cemetery. It runs along North Dale Drive. It's now heavily overgrown by brush and woods, but there were burials there. The bodies still are there. The headstones have long since been carried off by vandals. But that was a cemetery, and those who believe that Jean Lafitte, the famous pirate, lived in this area under an assumed name, they believe that he was buried in that lost cemetery. It's very difficult to locate. It's very overgrown, much like the Hartford Castle. Very overgrown. The tombstones are gone, although I've been told that you can seek the foundations for some of the tombstones. But that is, I'd like to learn more about that. The records for this lost cemetery were destroyed years ago, so we don't know exactly how many people were buried there and who was buried there. But we know it existed, we know its location. a Catholic cemetery in use from 1848 to 1858, and as our conspiracy theorist friends would say, the final resting place of Jean Lafitte the pirate, if you believe he came to this area.
Well, that's something that both of us will look into. Now you mentioned Hop Hollow.
Yes, Hop Hollow. Okay, the stories surrounding Hop Hollow are this, that when the Union soldiers were on burial detail, taking Confederate POWs who had perished of smallpox or some other disease or perished of battlefield wounds, were taking them to the cemetery along the Hop Hollow Road. They thought, hey, this is a long trip and the commanding officer's not watching us. Let's just ditch these bodies and say, we made the trip anyway. Who's going to check up on it?
Usually the people who were on burial duty, that was a punishment.
Yes, it was. It wasn't the most desirable duty in the world. And there are stories that basically they dump the bodies along the road, not even bothering to bury them, just leaving them as carcasses for the wild animals of the area to strip the bodies bare, and then would share a bottle of booze or have a nice smoke and then go back to prison and say, oh yes sir, we buried yes, it's all taken care of.
All done, we're good.
Now supposedly bones have been found along the road.
I read that when doing my research, that an Alton police officer actually
supposedly found some bones.
Kids found some bones in the woods, and the Alton Police Department went down there thinking it was a grisly murder, and it was bones.
Right.
And they dated the bones back to Civil War time.
Now we have to keep in mind that regardless of the number of bodies dumped along the road, they weren't buried, which means the bones could have been washed away by rain, they could have been carried off by wild animals. So I'm surprised they actually found any bones after such a long period of time. But it's definitely something that needs to be explored.
Well, you can go through Gettysburg still and
find
stuff.
Yes, you can.
So,
you can.
I think it just depends on what's there and what you're willing to spend the time to look for.
Exactly.
Well, so we've made it from the slavery in Alton, how Civil War got going in Alton, the prison in Alton, Hop Hollow, and then last was the Confederate Memorial. Can you tell us about the Confederate Memorial?
Interesting. For many years after the Civil War, that cemetery was literally a cow pasture. The townspeople were not interested in reclaiming it. After all, Alton was a Union town. These were Confederates, enemies of the nation. There were some primitive wooden grave markers at first, but I've heard people just carry them off for firewood or souvenirs, and it reverted to what it had been before. It was a cemetery, a cow pasture with cows milling about and doing their business on the graves of these men. Now it remained through the late 19th century and into the 20th century even. But then, at that time, Alton had a small chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They were relatives of Confederates who had fought in the war, relatives of Confederate veterans, and they thought that just is so disrespectful. We need to reclaim that cemetery, and that's precisely what they did. Originally, the plan was to have individual grave markers for all of the men buried in that cemetery, but it was impossible to determine where they were buried. So they decided to, on one mass monument that would list the names and divisions of all the men buried there, as well as the men buried on Smallpox Island. That was made possible through the federal government working in conjunction with the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
And that was erected in 1909?
That was in 1909.
Perfect. Well, that's one place where we're going to end up today. Thank you so much. It is always a pleasure coming
Bobbi,
in here
it's a joy seeing you again. You're such a knowledgeable lady. I wish you all good fortune in your endeavors.
Well, thank you. Now, where can everybody get these books? Do you have these on Amazon?
They're on Amazon. They can be ordered through the publisher, but of course you can only get a signed copy right here, courtesy of John Dunphy. The Second Reading Bookshop, 16 East Broadway, open Monday through Saturday from 11 to 5. I cited. The cats can leave a paw print if you like, but that's entirely up to you.
And what's the number here to get a hold of you?
618-462-2830. 618-462-2830.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and head over, I believe, to Smallpox Island, or what's left of it now.
Yes, what's left of it.
This is a chain of events, so we'll be back shortly.
Great.
Thank you. After our interview with John and finding out about the remains of Smallpox Island, Missy and I couldn't wait to get over there and check it out for ourselves. As I stepped out of the car and made my way to the memorial, I couldn't hide the feeling of overwhelming sadness. I made sure to take the time to read every name on the plaque and pay respects to the lives so tragically lost. We have chose to do a Frank's Box session over here at the Lock and Dam because it is a very windy, overcast day, and I feel that if we use a voice recorder, all we'd get is the wind. So this is something we like to use every now and then, but not too much of. So we're gonna see what we can find with the Frank's Box over here at the Lock and Dam. What you guys went through was absolutely horrible, being confined in that prison, or just being an innocent civilian who contracted the disease and got shoveled away to an island to pretty much die. Do you have anything you want to say to us? This is an opportunity for you to say stuff.
There's too many of them talking.
Right.
Time to go.
Time to go. That did sound like time to go. Yeah, it's time for us to go. After we concluded our session at the old Lock and Dam, we headed over to our next destination, the remains of the Civil War prison. There have been claims in this area of gentlemen in full Civil War uniform, Union or Confederate. I don't know. I'm not really sure. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to do any type of investigating in this area. We have the flour mill that's loud, and we have a truck over there that's running, and I'm not feeling it as much here. The brick limestone, when the original prison was torn down, was recycled and reused throughout Alton. That is one of the theories, that the paranormal energy stays in with the limestone, and that creates, could be why Alton is one of the most haunted towns in the world. We're not for sure, we don't know that, but it kind of goes with it, because there are different sightings throughout the town of men in the Civil War uniforms. So we're gonna go ahead and head off to Hop Hollow Road. After the prisoners passed, their journey to burial began. The next step on the trail was Hop Hollow Road. This was a shortcut into North Alton, where the deceased would be transported by wagon to be buried in their final resting spot. How many souls are lost on this road? There have been many claims of ghostly hitchhikers that vanish once they are picked up. Also, sightings of men in full uniform wandering the woods. Is this a connection to the prison or just lore? The final stop for these prisoners was here at the Confederate Cemetery. We're here at the last stop of the journey of the Confederate prisoners' bodies. If they made it up the trek of Hop Hollow, they would end up here and be placed in a shallow grave. There are so many graves around here that they couldn't even mark them, but instead they built this memorial to honor all the ones and the lives that were lost. I got a little dizzy when we were starting to walk, so I don't know. I'm just trying to figure everything out around here, but head is kind of spinning. Is there anybody out here with us? Is that a tombstone? Joseph.
That's so weird. He's the only one that's got
Right.
a headstone.
I don't understand that. Is there some significance to you being the only one with your own headstone? You can talk into this device that I'm holding in my hand, and I'll be able to hear you. Or you can talk into the microphone for the camera, and Missy will be able to hear you. Not all of our shows are necessarily hunting for ghosts, but discovering the history that can lead to a haunting. Following the exact trail that these lost souls took really made an emotional impact on me. The feeling of sadness that overcame me at every location proves to me that there is more to this story than we will ever know. Till next time, happy hunting.